I'd like you to understand three major themes and come away with having a sense of owning them yourselves, which is the question of the imperative right now of a credit system solution, the authority that you should have by wielding that, and the principle of the future, which it is based on. The imperative is based, if you really understand, the imperative based on Roosevelt's own struggle with the financial system as it existed in his time and his attempts to amend the Federal Reserve System and how he was able to institute his credit plan. The imperative also lies in the nature of the historical American credit system. The authority that you have to have lies in the history of the U.S. credit system. And it also lies in a modern proposal which applies that principle of the credit system. The future, the principle of the future lies also in the nature of the U.S. credit system, but it also lies in the principle of economy itself. So these are the three themes that I'd like you to comprehend, and in the question and answer period, everybody leaving the room today should understand these and be able to wield them, so ask any questions that are unclear. The thing I'd like to start off with is this general concept that you have to have in mind when you're understanding how the credit system should work, which is that essentially the principle that the river creates the banks. The banks don't create the river. And the economy, the principle of economy, is what is going to recreate a functional banking system. A banking system is not going to create the economy. The valid profit that will return to commercial banks after we reorganize them is going to be a profit that's shared with production and industry, the profit that comes about by transforming raw materials into finished goods. And the fact that a bank can facilitate that through creating a currency and means of payment is the only valid profit that a bank should partake in. There's no way that you're going to somehow have a banking system excrete a recovery. Or we've been waiting around for a long time for that. And people have been waiting around for that for hundreds of years. It's never happened. The real inherent principle here of the credit system lies in understanding that, because the question of banks really inherently have nothing to do with economy. And if you read through the Federal Reserve Act, you'll find that it has absolutely nothing to do with the economy. And some people may find that to be a strange statement. Isn't this how all of payments are made, or based on these Federal Reserve notes that we have? But in fact, the authors of that financial system that we're still operating in under today created it out of a conference at J.P. Morgan, who said after the 1907 crash, by the way, I'm never going to be able to bail you guys out again by buying all your stocks and bonds and securities. So we need a new big J.P. Morgan. It's a banker's bank, but it's more than just a banker's bank. It's an inherently laissez-faire mechanical system which is passively going to facilitate short-term commerce and supposedly, therefore, facilitate the growth of what's happening in the economy, but itself intending nothing. Itself doing guiding nothing. And if something happens, the financial system may recognize that it happens and say, okay, something has happened. I will recognize it and I will monetize it. But itself has nothing, has no inherent credit function. And in fact, this is what I'll mention and get into that Roosevelt came up against, that the Federal Reserve Act, as stated, not only had no interface with the economy, but even with its own member banks, had no capability to loan to them whatsoever. Today, we have to reapply with the understanding of the imperative now immediately in Congress and in the United States, and come forward with the fact that we have the authority based on an understanding of the history of the credit system and understanding what the future of the economy should look like. And as Kevin mentioned, and I'll say later, I was just at a hearing in Congress on the Mississippi River and things like that, and the utter incompetence of the system itself, which makes it impossible to even in natural disasters act, needs to be taken up. But the imperative and these things that I'm mentioning are based on now, and the authority is based on applying the history to this solution. And we can see exactly why it's necessary by understanding the difference between the current system and Alexander Hamilton's principle in the Bank of the United States. So what I'm going to go through and present to you here is a solution that we are going to be circulating in Congress, a draft legislation proposal to return to the original Bank of the United States. And that'll cause a lot of jeepers amongst a lot of creeps, and which is how you have to do it. Otherwise it won't work, because you can't slide something in. This is a return to the original Bank of the United States, and we have the authority that is the solution based on having done the research and discovered the unique role of John Quincy Adams, who you're going to be tough if you can prove him wrong with his speeches, in how that system was destroyed. The fact there was never a valid reason for its destruction. And since that's the case, when you look at how it functioned, you realize it's not simply a bank. In fact, as I've mentioned before, banks don't relate to economy inherently. It is the legislative means to implement the powers of Congress and any Congress to use the resources of the nation. And it was not a question of being a bank, it was a question of the Constitution and how the Constitution was formed by these individuals that wrote it up. That is now today the model of how we should propose a modern solution. So I'm going to present to you a little bit of an overview of what this draft legislation is going to look like. Then want to look at why you can see why it's so imperative, and why you can see why the Bank of the United States is the only way in which we can get around this inherently laissez-faire, otherwise, system of banking. And by touching on what Roosevelt did, Banking Act of 1933, and his way in which he ended up using the credit principle again, and came close and approximated the real principle of the Bank of the United States and Hamilton's principle. And then conclude on the future needed now that we have to create in the economy. So let's take a look at, let's return quickly to this principle, the general principle of credit. The question is, how do you build a future economy? How do you get somewhere? Well, you don't get there by just right now we're going to push through Glass-Steagall and the banks are going to be regulated, much shrunk in their capitalization, and they're going to somehow start lending again. The real issue is, if the United States government is going to put its credit and intend to build something, it's a future state. That's the real principle of the credit system, is the unification of the resources of the government and the economy itself, production. And that was, as you can see in the history of how the Jackson and Van Buren operation went about, the intention, when you pierce through all of the actions that they took to get rid of it, the real intention was to sever the relation between the government and the economy, right? And this is in all of these things, the inherent laissez-faire methodology that Aaron Burr and these guys imported, and John Randolph and so forth. But it was expressed chiefly in the way in which the credit system was destroyed. Because the principle of the credit system is that the government commits the resources of the nation to a future state. If you can't commit to the future, you inherently become a tool of whatever the external conditions are, right? And that's a general principle of all living species as well. If you can't develop to a higher state, you become sucked down in whatever fight over the scarce resources there are. And that's also inherently the whole issue now of the drying up of the Mississippi and the shrinking of our beef herds by 35% in the West, and the shrinking of our wheat production, all this. If we can't organize ourselves to a more efficient organization, we die. And the United States will die, guaranteed, if we don't implement this system. The commitment to the future of a government, therefore, is putting its credit in that sense. Do you want to have credibility? Well, are you going to finish the job? If you do, then whatever financial system you create, it's going to work. And you'd be able to work that out. However, we can actually have something much more specific than just that general intention, which is 100% true, by having looked at the Bank of the United States and seeing how it operated. So briefly, an overview now on a proposal to return to the original Bank of the United States, to restore the original Bank of the United States. So we're going to be able to ensure the investments, valid investments, industrial investments, people who invest in those kind of things, by the commitment of the government to this plan. Otherwise, there's no assurance of anybody's investments. And people who have been making 10% annually on money market funds and investment funds, sorry guys, that game is over. But we can insure you, if you would like to become a subscriber to this new Bank of the United States, you can become an owner of one of the stocks of this bank, and then we'll insure you some much lower percent interest. But you will be insured that the U.S. bonds that you currently hold, people who hold these treasuries, right now there's $10 trillion in U.S. treasuries, which are sound assets. They're U.S. bonds, and those assets, a trillion. Japan has $1 trillion, just China has $1 trillion, and other countries, and U.S. holders can become subscribers to a new bank. This is Hamilton's principle in the middle of the Revolutionary War, when we had tens and hundreds probably of different kinds of certificates for different payments of uniforms of the army and other domestic men who were industrialists. Today we have a problem. We don't want people who run a hedge fund to have any guidance over this bank. In Hamilton's time, that wasn't necessarily a problem. The Bank of the United States had 25 stockholders, and they were the people who were the domestic moneyed men, as Hamilton referred to them, the industrialist investors, and generally people who had committed to win the war. They weren't traitors by any means. They were, and they also had allegiance to the country. So those were people that you wouldn't have a problem with directing what they invest in, because they were going to invest the capital of that bank so formed into manufactures and the like. So today we have a trick. We have to essentially direct whatever valid assets are out there. We're directing them into an institution which can directly lend, which is the fundamental nature of the solution, which is a credit lending institution, and an institution which puts the government's funds so subscribed into the capital of the bank, and also the revenues of taxation, which are going to have to be much increased in the proportion coming from businesses and revenue duties by protecting our manufacturing. We protect, we don't protect our citizens very well overseas, as indicated, but as we should protect, we do protect our commerce vehicles, and why should not we protect our own manufacturers? The protection of the government is a duty of the government. It's not a handout, which came from Jackson. that that idea did not come from anywhere else. So this is the nature that these funds of the government and those who hold U.S. bonds. This is one of the ways in which the proposal could work. And we take this and we also allow people like Roosevelt's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the way he used it. The Secretary of Treasury was able to market the bonds of the RFC, which is just a meaning that the RFC would borrow money from the public and commercial banks, and then it would lend it out for all of its purposes, which we'll get into. But either way, either taking the existing U.S. treasuries and allow them to become now stockholders of this bank, meaning they'll, as the bank lends for the purposes in which I will describe, they'll make a valid profit related to the increase of production. But it will be a massive credit that will be capable of generating a recovery and also recapitalizing the banks. So without getting into the specifics, let's say $1 trillion, right? You hear the deficit of the Army, the American Society for Civil Engineers. It's beyond that. It's really bad. And I was just on one of their conference calls recently, and they were saying, well, we really hope people will wake up here with the Mississippi shutdown, and we haven't done anything since our last report card. Hey, guys, remember that report card about our infrastructure? But the government is not intending to do anything. And also in meetings in Congress, they have no plan. There is no plan. And that is why this proposal is so crucial. They said, well, maybe we'll have Glass-Steagall, but you can't think past that. Well, if you don't think past that, you're going to have a bunch of just take your eraser and erase 90% of banks in the country. What is going to capitalize in the sense of allowing banks to lend? What is the capital in which they will be able to lend? You have to look beyond Glass-Steagall, right? Which is, and I'll review what that was. It was the separation of commercial and investment banking, but it included a series of provisions, and it included the bankruptcy reorganization. So in that process, you have to be thinking what's going to now create the context for the new regulated commercial bank system. So we take this plan, $1 trillion, we say, and it will be amended by the relevant authorities. But we start out with that, and so I said there's 10 trillion in treasuries, so you could concentrate that. So instead of people out there holding these things and speculating with them and using them for, let's just say, liquidity, or as they say, basically lubricating the financial system. This is how economists like to talk about it. Well, these 10 trillions are great because it lubricates the financial system. Maybe we should have 16 trillion of outstanding debt. There's no way to determine mathematically the amount of bonds that we should have out there unless it's operating within a credit system. Hamilton was able to take these certificates, reissue them, because he tied the future extinguishment of the debt at that time, which was $70 million of U.S. debt. 50 of it was domestic, and then 25 was the state debts. He put them all together, reissued, but in the same act by which he created the debt, he tied it to the revenue duties that would be gone through. The first act of Congress on July 4th was saying we're going to apply duties on foreign goods. And that was the first act of sovereignty, but that allowed then to tie that to the future extinguishment, created the credit. But that's what Hamilton's credit was. It was that he was taking these evidences of debt, which was the price of liberty, which is not something to get rid of, and he tied that to the growth of the economy. So it wasn't a question of cutting your left leg to save your right, as you have the theory today, right? If you don't spend money, you don't have, and then you can go on for about an hour. As long as you say that, then you can go on for about an hour, whether you're a congressman on C-SPAN or the like. No, Hamilton never cut anything. It was the principle that there should be no self-evident debts, because the issue of debt is actually, on the flip side, credit. And there's some people in Washington, D.C. that are realizing you have to understand credit and you have to understand the quality of human life in an economy. You can't look at this stuff mathematically. No self-evident debts, meaning there's no debt of the government that just sits there and is not tied to the productive increase of the economy that's going to then extinguish that debt. Right? This is just accounting. So the issue is he took what was a financial system and a bank system, and he used it for the purposes of the nation state, which is what we're doing here. The proposal is to take the same model where we channel, instead of people just sitting around with these bonds, we channel them for the same purposes in which how Hamilton did it. We bring them together and we tie them to the future construction of the Nawapa 21 project, which I'll get into, and infrastructure. In addition, we will be allowing all these state and municipal cities which are bankrupt. They will be now able to be receiving loans, and the people who hold state and municipal debt can also subscribe to be stockholders of this bank, not just U.S. bonds. So however it ends up becoming the states and cities, instead of someone just having a creditor over here that they owe money to, the bank will be the creditor, and the bank will be able to lend to them. They will also be able to sell municipal bonds for projects that the bank will create, like the RFC did. And there will be, as we had with Hamilton's Bank, there will be branches in every Federal Reserve district which will be able to directly lend, instead of this one mega bank that just lends and discounts for all these other banks. Right? That's the nature of the Federal Reserve System, as I went through in the beginning. It's a club of banks which basically buy and sell U.S. debt, which is monetized by the Federal Reserve and not tied, as Hamilton's maxim, and therefore the Federal Reserve is contrary to Hamilton's maxim, to the future industry. So there will be this, and it will be doing two things. First, to just put up front, because this is going to cause some pain to all these guys, it will not loan to any commercial banks that haven't gone through Glass-Steagall. So let's see what that was all about. So when Roosevelt became president, 6 days after he was inaugurated, he put the Emergency Banking Act through, right? There was a Bank Conservation Act. This was the conservators that would go into the bank, and they were appointed in every bank. There's a lot of banks. I don't know how the Comptroller of the Currency handled that, but they appointed a conservator for every bank, and they went in the back and they set up a little, I guess, a trust fund that would receive the worthwhile deposits, the ones that were still valuable, and everything else was frozen and worthless and somehow gotten rid of. I don't know whether it was by the toilet or whether they burned it in the back. I don't know. But either way, they went through that process. They also allowed these banks to recapitalize themselves, to issue preferred stock, which would allow them to raise back their capital stock, because most of it would be gone. So now the capital stock, which is just the seed money of any bank, what the stockholders take part in, could be bought by the RFC. So the RFC was helping to aid in recapitalizing these banks. And there was a few other things that aren't so important. But then, very soon after that, a couple months, Senator Glass and Representative Steagall were able to push through the next big thing, which is the Banking Act of 1933. And when people refer to the Glass-Steagall Act, they're also referring to, in general, the Banking Act of 1933. That's when the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was set up, which basically says, if a bank fails, we'll create a new bank in its place without the capital stock, but with equal to the deposits that valid people had money, whatever ratio with however the insurance is. It maybe not be able to back it all up, but that's all the FDIC does. But more importantly was the separation of investment and commercial banking. And that said that basically the bond department of member banks of the Federal Reserve could not engage in any securities trading, buying and selling investment securities. They couldn't underwrite securities, and they couldn't interlock with security companies, hedge funds, right? Investment, those would not be possible under Glass-Steagall. So not only can a bank not itself be involved in this securities trading, but it also can't be involved in interlocking with a different firm, nor can it receive deposits by firms that are involved in that, which is a similar thing related to the investment banks. And also, which is not the Glass-Steagall Act, which was part of the Banking Act of 1933, the Federal Reserve could set the percentage in which any of the banks could even engage in loans secured by stocks of companies. Stocks, so you know, the speculation involves in raising up the value of a company artificially. So loans that banks were making based on stocks and bonds. And that was about 2%. And Paul Gallagher of EIR has gone through. That was 2% that you could be allowed to. So it was very well regulated. So that's a process that's going to have to go through before any bank is going to be eligible to a loan to the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States will have branches around the country, as I said, and will be able to loan to these commercial banks. The original Federal Reserve Act didn't allow the Federal Reserve to even loan to banks. It didn't loan to anybody. It's just kind of a funny thing to look through. And I can say more about that later. But let's get on to the real purpose here, which is now the lending priorities of this Bank of the United States, with whatever capital it ends up being, will be to lend for all of the producers related to acts of Congress for national drought and flood control systems and other necessary infrastructure. Any company that's, and also increase of the plant capacity, but any company that's related to constructing or making parts for storage reservoirs, canals, aqueducts, pipelines, power plants, the like, and manufacturers of excavators, large capacity trucks, earth moving equipment, cranes, tunnel boring machines, drilling machines, pumps, valves, intake, discharge headers, all these kinds of things, right? Mining companies, smelting companies. We have a decreasing amount of foundries in the United States for rolling. We have a decreasing amount of cement kilns. I think there's only 80. Most of the foundries now are done overseas. We have the need for all the big large motors, large capacity pumps. Also mines which mine copper, limestone, again for the cement, and also for steel, companies which make steel, aluminum, and copper. And also machine tools. You know, this is the big deal. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can go on their website, you can download abstracts for each decade, each year really, and if you look at those, especially if you go through the 1950s up to the present time, it's a real educational, just looking at the parts on manufacturing. But if you look at the decade of the 90s, we lost about 30% of our manufacturing, which is why we have to, if the derivatives market were to crash right now and everything was gone, there'd be nothing, because the consumer economy, which is 75% in the United States of our GDP, is based on credit from shadow banking, right? The only way in which that was able to be maintained has been through this shadow banking, fake money. That's the only reason why anybody can keep buying anything. The productive side of the economy, which we're going to be creating, is therefore the only way in which you're going to capitalize these banks, right? Banks cannot have a valid profit if there's not a productive economy. Again, my point. So that's why there's no way in which you can somehow regulate the commercial bank system and get anything. They're gone, and their nature is to only partake in production. So banks themselves can't keep lending if they weren't on the side having these money market funds with the super high interest related to all this derivatives stuff. And we can go through in the Q&A if people want to discuss the mortgage-backed securities and what a fraud that was all based on. Also, manufacturers of double steel miter gates and other things for our waterways, for our lock and dam system. Manufacturers of head gates, turbine wheels, impellers, generating units, switchgear, transmission lines, locomotives, rail lines. All of these manufacturers will be will be the priority of the directors. The directors of the bank, that's the tricky thing. Where are you going to find them? Do you want the president to appoint them all, or do you want them to be somehow selected by the stockholder process, which is the case in Biddle's bank, or I should say John Quincy Adams and Monroe's bank, and Hamilton's bank? Well, Franklin Roosevelt has a nice lesson for that. He had a plan, which I'll review briefly as a little bit in a minute, to have credit banks that would have on their board a majority of the directors be engaged and actively engaged in some industrial pursuit in the district. So that is what you want to have. You can either have that appointed by the president, but if you want to have a system which is more in the nature of the Constitution, that's not dependent on the executive branch, but it's dependent on all three branches and the whole Constitution itself. The Bank of the United States was not something that was just diktat by the president. There were 5 government directors appointed by the president with advice and consent of the Senate, and one of them became president. You want to ensure that. But all of the rest of them were representatives of the economy itself. And that is kind of what you want to have. We can restrict those who would be voting stockholders to elect themselves directors, perhaps, to the remaining patriotic companies in the United States. So if we allow these patriotic companies in the United States, that if they hold U.S. bonds or not, but in either way, if these kind of companies and agricultural groups, not the big Cargill, Monsanto, big companies that have no allegiance to the United States, but the remaining U.S. companies which have their capital here and which have the interests of the United States in mind, they should be, if there are going to be private directors, they should be involved. So that is what they're going to be lending for as a priority, and that's the reason I'm mentioning the directors, because the directors decide who to lend. Right? It's not all based on the government itself. Although the acts of Congress will create contracts. But the point here is the money of the government that's appropriated every year, which is the only way anything gets done, which is ridiculous, is much different than the credit of the government being loaned and tied to something and paying the contractors that are going to build the different parts of the project through a credit lending institution to then actually get the job done that way. The credit of the government's now put into a direction. It's not a momentary, year by year, just appropriating money for various things. So then we have some things. We can make manufacturers of all these listed things have a special rate from the bank. The bank is going to have access to make sure that the schedule of its lending for all these things is tied to the appropriate schedule of the construction of the project. So they're going to be informed. So there will be some kind of management division of this NWAPA 21 authority, right? They're going to have oversight of the progress of labor training, plant capacity buildup. They're going to be looking at how many people are becoming skilled and trained and capable to be thrown onto the work site. Machine tool factories, how many more people we're going to get that are skilled to make that. That's going to change the output of that productive factory of the machine tools that can make all these parts that are here mentioned and hardly made in the United States anymore at all. And they're going to be seeing the progress of the dam schedule. Things like that. As the potential increases in the economy, then there can be more credit safely lended. And that was the principle of Roosevelt's RFC, which is that the maturities of all the loans of the RFC and the renewal of the loans of the RFC with Roosevelt, not with Hoover, was tied to the successful completion of these projects. They were never, oh, sorry, guy, we just loaned you last year, but now you're your project, your ditch or irrigation project's not, you're going to fail on that, and you're finished. The intention was to build the economy, so there was an insurance in the way in which the thing was managed, in accord with Hamilton's principle, that you ensure the success of it by making the maturity of the loans based on that. So the time of the credit has to be tied to that. The Bank of the United States also did something which Jackson canceled by severing the government with the economy, which was all of the collected taxes, as I say, largely by duties at that point, were available at all times until they were needed to be appropriated by the government for its various things that Congress had decided to appropriate money for. So it maximized the usefulness of a financial system. You're more and more making a financial system in relation to economy and production, which is, again, the principle of credit that should pervade the financial system. So less and less, when people think of financial system, do they think of money, but they think of the purpose for which it's formed. And that's actually the key issue with the Bank of the United States, which is a means of the powers of Congress, is that once people abstract it and say, this is the bank over here, and Jackson got the mob to say, this is a bank over here, right? Well, it was not. It was a reflection of the economy. And that's why Jackson was not attacking the bank. Jackson was attacking the economy, right? And so if you abstract the bank from the means of the powers of Congress and what it was supposed to facilitate, then you can lose sight of the issue. But the bank would maximize the funds of the government deposited in all the branches of the bank by lending them at all times. Recently, people have been ripped off in the cities and states of the United States because if you're a city councilman, you get together and you say, well, the Constitution of the United States says we have to balance our budget, so let's take out a loan. We'll go to the money market and get a loan, and we'll be able to build this long-term project that's not in our budget. They do capital budgeting all the time in the cities and states. That's established. We don't do capital budgeting in the federal government. But the cities and states have a problem because we're inside a speculative economy, right? They're floating around in this shadow banking system. So in the time between expenditure on their projects and raising of that initial money, they want to make some profit with it. So they stick it in an investment fund, and then they lose it. And that happened to cities and states around the country. They went bankrupt because they didn't have a place in which to make that credit available, which it would be in the bank. And we have a provision here that would allow all the cities and states to deposit the funds into the branches of the bank, which could then be lent out, maybe to them, or maybe to somebody else, in the time between its collection and appropriation. And that would be the case of the federal government also. It maximizes all available federal monies at all times for the purpose of increasing the productive aspect of the economy, which therefore actually increases the money raised and so forth. So it will take over surface transportation. It will allow to lend on the basis of the gas tax that will be deposited in that bank, and it will be the holders of those funds as well as all the revenue duties of the newly designed duty system to ensure that we actually have these companies here in the United States. Other powers of the Secretary of Treasury to ensure the success of this plan will be that any time we need to apply Hamilton's principle, his maxim, that's in his public credit report at the end, where he says it should be a principle of guidance here that now that we've established the system, that we never veer from the creation of a debt and the creation of the productive means to extinguish it is ever broken. And therefore we can change the interest and so forth on some of the bonds that are outstanding and tie them to the future increase of productivity of the economy with the NWAPA plan. The Secretary of Treasury can do that. The Secretary of Treasury also will be able to issue greenbacks, if necessary, interest-free Treasury notes to the bank for specific purposes of the NWAPA project lending. And to ensure that these things are tied, again, to the project, they won't be issued and then just forgotten. But as the stock of the U.S. in the bank, which in Hamilton's bank and John Quincy Adams' bank was 1/5 of the total capital, as the U.S. stock in the bank makes dividends with the profit of the economy, right? The physical economy is growing. The bank is a reflection. The value of the stock is just a reflection of the growing economy. The dividend, meaning the amount of interest, the amount of profit that the government gets from the total stock, is now tied to these greenbacks that are issued. So as the future economy grows and we get these dividends, you can retire these treasury greenbacks. Also, with the authorization of Congress, John Quincy Adams' principle, which is capital budgeting. You've heard this term before? The idea of creating credit and tying it to the future construction of a project. Hey, that's how John Quincy Adams did it. And he created the very first, I think, big national infrastructure project, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, that was funded purely on credit. Because what he did is he said, we're going to subscribe to the stock of this company that's, back in that day you had canal companies that would run the canal later on and be in charge of building the whole thing also. We're going to subscribe to the stock of this company based on the future dividend, the dividends which may accrue on our stock of the bank. So he didn't appropriate money for this canal. He said, we'll subscribe to that stock based on the future profit. And that's what also Secretary of Treasury will be able to do. Also, what the Bank of the United States did was to manage the cycles of the economy. So when the farmers and the agricultural, the harvesting of crops takes place in cycles, seasons. So does mining companies. All industrial companies have seasons, cycles, right? Productive cycles, how long it takes to turn the raw material into the finished good. Some, manufactured car companies, it's yearly cycles, or 2 years. And even the garment industry, they have year-long cycles and so forth. The bigger industrial operations and agricultural operations of the United States were managed by the Bank of the U.S. It was something under Biddle, which was the main way in which the whole economy actually was able to grow and work. And it was everybody could get credit, farmers on the lower end, but also the big buyers and sellers of commercial agricultural goods going up and down the Mississippi in the 1820s and the 1830s. And so what the bank did is it would foresee when the credit would come due on the account of the farmers, more the merchants, and it would basically balance their credits and debts in accord with the production cycle. Today, if you're a big company, you've got to go to the money market and you've got to issue a bond, right? The industrial companies will issue bonds and somebody will buy it. And then that industrial company can now make its purchase of the raw materials or the parts to make its products. Instead, there will be low interest provided by this bank and an insurance of the lender by the fact that this bank will be the guiding principle and structure of the whole financial system. So it will manage the larger cycles. It will go from the top down. The bigger cycles of trade, it will facilitate that with what's called the bills of exchange trade, which is just simply promissory notes between companies. A miller makes flour. He goes to the person who makes bread, and he says, here's my promissory note, and I'll pay you later, right? It's a future payment system. And the guy who, now the miller has this promissory note from the guy who makes the bread, and he says, well, I want to buy things with this now. So he goes to the bank, and the bank does what's called discounting the commercial security, the agreement between the two parties, makes banknotes, and now this guy can go buy things, the miller, And the person who sells the bread later goes and retires the same banknotes in the bank. So this is the bills of exchange trade and discounting of securities, which happens on all levels. And the bank will facilitate that if necessary, but also to ensure the fact, because here we're sitting in a situation which, as I started out with, this will ensure the survival of the country, and it will ensure the survival of the assets of any valid asset, right? Which is the only thing anybody can hope. If you're a big investor, the United States economy right now, once we pop this bubble with Glass-Steagall and the shadow banking system, when I refer to shadow banking, I'm referring to the fact that there were banks that were doing lending and deposits and things with low interest largely, and savings and loan banks. But then they created this, which Thomas Hernig, who's now vice president of the FDIC, goes through sequentially in a good paper in 2011. They created a vast competition for these banks by the mutual market funds, by these more risky savings and loan, which ended up the crash of the savings and loan, and other things with derivatives. Once that's popped, say goodbye. There's the whole ability of the financial system, the payment system, is going to need a managerial aspect to take over, as Roosevelt took over the Federal Reserve. And we will be able to ensure valid profit from that. But if you can't, we're not going to say, well, we're so far gone, and we've lost so much of our production, and we've lost so much that we're just going to have to roll over and die. The federal government will legislate through this plan the ability to create special notes that can be used to discount these commercial securities, valid ones, for production and agriculture and transport, and not allow them to be monetizable into any kind of other money or notes. So there'll be just credit agreements between the various parties. There'll be special notes, which Lincoln's economist Stephen Colwell had this idea of having basically special notes for bills of exchange that would, you have a maturity on a bill of exchange, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, and before it matures, you can't pull from that credit money. So you can't make a credit agreement into money. And this is the thing with mutual funds, is you say, well, I want my money now. And so you're going to cash out and get your money right away. But a credit agreement has time. You have to stick with the time of the credit agreement. So this kind of system it's imperative when you look at Roosevelt's reorganization of the Federal Reserve. Right? The Federal Reserve System couldn't even lend to commercial banks, much less anybody, any individual. It couldn't lend for industry. It couldn't lend for any farmer that had to transport their goods. It couldn't even discount these bills of exchange I'm referencing beyond 6 months. So a bunch of farmers went up in the 20s because they had no way to get credit. It couldn't lend to commercial banks. It couldn't even discount securities of commercial banks for individuals. So what Roosevelt did after this bankruptcy reorganization that I talked about, Roosevelt and his team and Congress authorized the Federal Reserve to lend directly to banks and to assist them. And also Roosevelt authorized in 1933 the Federal Reserve to also just general commerce. But the big thing was the banks, even after being organized and giving the Federal Reserve there was a series of 3 things that amended the Fed to finally lend and discount to people. They weren't lending, and it was inherent in the Federal Reserve System why they weren't lending, because of the way in which the system is just this jail cell, of banks between the economy. It doesn't directly interface with anything, and there's all these rules and regulations and incentives to be short-term, nothing beyond 3 months. So what happened was that Roosevelt came up with a plan to institute 12 credit banks. And he actually had Representative Steagall introduce this plan for 12 credit banks, one in each Federal Reserve district, that would directly lend for industry. And that was the key aspect here. Let me just find this thing. And Jesse Jones of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation said, hey, people are coming around here with loan applications all the time. What are you guys doing? And they found out that commercial banks, only 374 out of 1,700 applications were approved, even though they were completely sound companies. But it's because a sound asset didn't matter. It mattered as how long was the loan. We don't want long-term loans, and we don't want companies. We don't want industry companies. We just want the short-term merchant stuff, which is the Adam Smith idea, right? Is that you have people who buy and sell goods and buy and sell money become the primary receiver of the blessing of the financial system versus the people who produce the goods, right? People who produce the goods, you would think, should be primary to the people who just buy and sell the goods. But the whole financial system was set up for the people who buy and sell the goods. So Roosevelt had to go around this, and it's a useful lesson for today and why the Bank of the United States is imperative, because it just demonstrates again that there's no way you can take this existing financial system and do anything with it, because it's inherently based around the idea that banks create the economy, which they don't. The plan was to directly get a credit bank in every Federal Reserve district that would directly loan for industry, 5-year loans, and have this industrial board and also buy the bonds of these companies and so forth. But it was to be of the equal capital to the need of the economy. They've done an analysis of how many people need to be employed, how much does these industries need. They did a full analysis like we did similarly in this report, right? In the NWAPA 21 report, you can find that we have a whole thing of what's needed for the project itself, what's our capacity of companies right now, approximately how many jobs it would create based on the Parsons Company analysis, things like that. That's going to then determine what the credit of the bank needs to be. And that's what Roosevelt did. He said, well, we need $700 million. And so we're going to take this FDIC stock, Federal Reserve banks, credit banks now are going to be capitalized with this. It was going around the Federal Reserve's restrictions of this jail cell of banks and directly lending for industry. Congress didn't pass it, however. So the plan B was to give the Federal Reserve the ability to directly lend to industry. As I said, it never had the capability to even lend to a bank, right? It could discount a security of a member bank, but it couldn't even lend. So this was now saying, no, the financial system is going to be organized by a credit principle. It's going to be organized around taking these 12 credit banks, putting the collected taxes of the U.S. in those banks, not in the Fed, where they don't go anywhere, right? They're going to be lent out at all times. That was in there, and having them run by industrial leaders. So instead, you got this Plan B, which was the Federal Reserve can lend. There will be an industrial advisory committee to the board, and the whole thing got caught up in paperwork, and it didn't really work that well. You had about 10 steps before you could finally get your loan. Whereas if you had a director of the bank, they could have just said, yeah, loan, right? So that didn't work. What worked was the expanded RFC credit institution. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1934 was now authorized to loan to industry. Before that, it was just something to assist in an emergency, agriculture and banks and railroad companies. But an emergency is something which you view as an exception. But the rule of economy should be one of future growth, the principle of the credit system. So Roosevelt was going in here and saying, well, we've got this real demand for industry, don't we? And the last 20 years hasn't been so good. This whole system's been screwed up. Our real economy got sacrificed to speculators. So what he was doing was not simply trying to create this Emergency Bank Act and get people back employed again. Some people maybe thought that. The monetarists thought that. The people screaming, we liked our laissez-faire Federal Reserve Bank. But what he was doing was he was reviving McKinley, what had not been in the United States since McKinley, where McKinley created the greatest growth for 6 years straight. So what Roosevelt did was reinstituting that the whole economy should be bound by production. That production creates the financial system. It creates what banks can lend. It is now the new context, that continuous drive of growth. And so he created with the RFC in 1934 the Industrial Advances Act, and he authorized it to loan for industry on 5 years, and also all of the emergency loans that had been the year before for all these various things, to extend them as needed, reissue loans as needed to ensure the success of the project, and also to loan not just generally industry, but specifically on mining and things like that. So you had a wave now of, once again, building the country with an intention. It would have been better to have these 12 credit banks, because it would have been more permanent, right? And it wouldn't have relied so much on Roosevelt, which is the other point Lyndon LaRouche made, was that when Roosevelt died, the system died. And so you don't want a system that's just based on the executive branch. You want a system that's now inherent through and a direct expression of the means of the Constitution. So that's what you have to have. So, but this is what I was saying. This Hamiltonian principle was throughout this 1934 Act, tying the loans to the success of the project. So that's very interesting, because you find just how rotten that Federal Reserve System was. It was created as this passive laissez-faire instrument, supposedly to stop a panic, but then it had no capability to deal with the panic that was supposed to create. Because it was created to say, well, we want to keep our system, J.P. Morgan, we want to keep going. But we don't want to have a panic again, because we don't want to lose out, right? Speculators. But then it facilitated the Wall Street control, the London financial control, to just crush the U.S. economy. But then in that, it's interesting to see that in the intrinsic law itself, the Act of 1913 gave no capability to prevent that from happening, because it didn't have long-term growth. It had no intention to aid a government to have long-term growth, and it gave an incentive to this short-term stuff. And anyway, there's a few things in there which really show you how then the crisis, why it happened because of the act. But then what Roosevelt had to do to even assist the economy basically threw into the discard many of the provisions by now creating, with the Banking Act of 33, but then also the Banking Act of 35, a number of things with centralized power, made it more in line with the needs of the economy, and then trying to get the loans going. Future of the economy has to be based on the needs of the power of the nation, not the needs of the emergency of the present. We have the emergency of the present, but we have to have much more authority as the citizens of a nation and as the government of a nation to use the powers of Congress for the purpose of the nation. And you have to rediscover that. First, you clear out the trash by throwing Andrew Jackson in the trash. And you realize you don't have to have any of those assumptions, since they were all based on a foreign-imposed British system and an empire that was trying to destroy the United States at that time. And, in fact, has basically defined the character of the United States, since we continue to have to struggle for our independence as a sovereign nation. A sovereign nation should make sure that we don't have to shut down all the barge traffic in the United States. Unfortunately, built into the system right now, it makes it impossible for Missouri River water to even be brought into the Mississippi. We should be able to have our full long-term plan for our cattle, which are being slaughtered because of this ethanol mandate on corn and also because of the drought. And we lost 20% of our wheat crop in Kansas this year. National wheat crop comes from Kansas. They have a 90% drought. The long-term planning that was going to be achievable with this credit system that Roosevelt had set up, would have allowed us to build the needed structure of a drought and flood control system. This crisis now would not have been necessary. So those purposes that the nation has, the interests of the people, those purposes have to be coincident with the way in which we redesign it and restructure the system. But there's no other thing that's going to work, and everyone needs this solution. So we're going to be putting this solution in an altered form from what I presented here, but the essential elements being the same as the way in which we can think of the next step after Glass-Steagall, and that the principle of NWAPA is really something we haven't done before. It'll be a new expression of the means of the powers of Congress, because it will tie the states again together in a new relationship that they have never been before. We're not going back to old hat. We're not doing an emergency here. We're going to a future system which will redefine the relations amongst the states, not necessarily by law, but by economy. And Nicholas Biddle, just to conclude on this point, said that the greatest legislators in the United States in the 1820s were not those who were elected, but was the great political institution of the steamboat and the auxiliary canals. That they did more to transform the relation of the population and their thinking of the population than any legislator could ever dream to do. So NWAPA will be similar. In a way, it will transform the relation between people in Arizona, New Mexico, people in California and Washington State. Every state will have a different outlook in how they relate to one another, but now with the new industries for new purposes. We're not trying to get employment, right? We don't want jobs. We want specific kinds of jobs that relate to a more energy flux dense economy and a more integrated and powerful economy. So we don't want to give people money. We want to give them credit, right? People don't want to have money that they can throw away aimlessly. They want to have credit that can allow them to raise their condition. And that's the moral thing to do. And the productive thing to do is all of these new industries and the science which will then bloom for all of the new kinds of cement and steel. And these different things we'll be doing in building this kind of plant. So we need this generational act which will allow us to not only return to the history of the credit system, but make use of the knowledge that is actually existing among us in the citizenry, and especially the elder citizenry. So these three things, the imperative of this system, which lies in the fact that this is how the United States was built, in the fact that you have to return to that, and the fact that this is the only way in which Roosevelt was able to get around this system now. And we're not saying we're going to abolish the Federal Reserve. Let's deal with that separately, right? You have worthless assets over here. You just say that the condition has been created due to the actions of the government since the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which the Federal Reserve is not sufficient in and of itself. So we have to create this system over here, this original Bank of the United States, which will operate as a commercial bank, not an investment bank, which is the Federal Reserve is. We have a commercial bank operating as the Bank of the United States. And we may end up finding that certain things in that system have to be reformed, but let's focus on this solution here.
We'll make